I'm Sharon Bryson, CEO of the North Carolina Association of CPAs. We have the distinct pleasure of having Dr. Rick Niswander, Vice Chancellor of Administration and Finance at East Carolina University, here with us this morning to address some of our student members' questions regarding the next version of the CPA exam.
What type of new items will appear on the next version of the exam?
Most of the new items that will appear on the next version starts in April of 2017 are already there. The kinds of questions will be a little bit different, but many of the types of questions have already been pre-tested to make sure that they'll provide good questions. A good example is the document review simulation questions that are on the exam right now and will continue to be on the exam. Over the last couple years, we've seen some changes, that being one of them, of questions that will, different types of questions that will be on the exam. So the change in April is not going to be so much the kinds of questions, but the types of things that are asked. The exam is moving more from remember and understanding and application, which is what the current version of the exam is, to those two categories plus analysis and evaluation. And those are what are referred to as higher order skills that require you to do more thinking rather than just memorization. So the new version of the exam, the big shift is going to be that shift more than the types of questions.
Will students have to change their study tactics or their habits in their studying in order to be successful with the next updated version of the exam?
It obviously depends a lot on the individual student. Everybody's a little bit different. But in general, I think the answer is no. You won't have to change how you study for the exam. And that's because what the exam is going to be testing is very similar to what you're studying in school right now. You have to initially learn the rules. What's the rules for a lease? And then you have to apply that to some sort of a small problem. But in what you do every day in school, you don't stop there. You have to then take that information about how you do it and what the answer to a small problem is and put it in a larger problem that has more pieces, more complexity. You have to think about what the implications of what you're doing are. You have to think about what the balance sheet or income statement or footnotes will look like when you account for a lease in this way or that way. So what the exam is going to be testing are those additional pieces that you're already learning in class. What it is going to require, though, I think, is for you to much more deliberatively understand the material, get it really deeply in your mind as to what the material is telling you. It's not simply sufficient to know that these are the rules associated with leases. What do you do with it? So to the extent you're not doing that, then it will require a change in how you study. But for the most part, how you're studying right now is the same kind of things you need to do for the exam.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the new TBS questions and how these kinds of questions will appear on the new version of the exam?
The TBS questions will be those questions that are predominantly used for those higher order skills. Multiple choice will still be used for the remember and understanding. Will be used for a lot of the application, not all of it, the more simple applications. But once you get to analysis and evaluation, then the TBS questions are going to come into play. Because analysis and evaluation requires you to have some kind of set of circumstances or some materials to be able to make a decision on. So using the lease example again. The lease question for an analysis might be, here's the leases that this company has, and here's the footnote that is a result of those leases. Is the footnote correct? That's where maybe the document review simulations might come into play, where you have to take a look at what they've done, take a look at a footnote that results from that, make sure that they've accounted for it correctly so you can adjust the footnote if it needs to be adjusted. And the TBS is the thing that's going to get you there. So the TBS is particularly the document review section. The question might be, here's this document. It's not going to say it's a lease document. It's going to say, here's this document. How would you account for it? I mean, obviously the question is more complicated than that, but here's this document. How would you account for it? You don't know for sure before you start reading it if it's a lease or it's a purchase or it's an operating lease or it's a capital lease or you're buying something with a bank loan. You have to read the document to figure that out. So unlike the classroom where in intermediate accounting, Chapter 12 was leases, and so you knew that everything you studied in Chapter 12 had to do with leases, on the exam and in real life, that's not the way it works. So here's this document, what do you do with it? That's the kind of thing that requires you to do some analysis and some evaluation, and the TBSs are going to be used for that.
With the shift of the new exam to a more cognitive, critical thinking approach, do you think that a candidate with previous work experience might have more of an advantage over a candidate with no experience? Or in other words, would working in public accounting for a time provide a candidate with an advantage?
The exam is a blend of the kinds of things you clearly learn in school, kind of the rules and how you apply them in relatively simple situations, and the kinds of things that you more likely learn in public practice, the application of those rules to a specific situation. You get some of that in the classroom, but you also get some of that when you're out in public practice or working in industry. So, since everybody's different, to the extent that you're lacking on the application side, on the analysis and evaluation side from how you study or what your program is, then being in public practice or industry for a year or two could be an advantage. But the disadvantage of waiting a year or two is a lot of that rule-based information is gone, right? And so you have to have somewhat of a balance between making sure you remember what the rule is and how you would apply it to a situation and applying it to a situation. And that's why I think that this notion of in your classroom, you're learning how to apply it and how to analyze and how to evaluate is very, very helpful. And schools and colleges of accounting have been doing this for years. We're ramping it up a little bit more as time goes on. But I think it's going to continue to be more beneficial to take the exam before you get out of school than when you've been out for a while. Part of the reason also is that when you're out and when you're working, you don't have time to study for the exam. And you need to take it when you stand the best opportunity to pass, and that's while you're in school or immediately thereafter.
Will I still receive credit for passing sections of the current exam after the next exam launches?
If you have passed one of the sections of the exam prior to the change in April of 17, you will continue to get credit for that, subject to the 18-month window, so you don't need to retake it, no matter what the section is.
For candidates who have already completed sections of the exam before the changes and may or may not be affected by the extended wait times on score release, will there be an extension on the validity of their scores from previous sections?
That's really a question for state boards of accountancy. They're the ones that set the rule on the 18-month window, for example, which is the basis of the question. I would suggest that if there's a candidate that is going to run up against that window, that they talk to their state board, because there may be some accommodation that can be made, or there may not, but it's always worth asking the question. But in general, the window isn't going to change unless the state boards of accountancy decide that they would like to make that change.
After instituting the exam changes, will scores in the next version of the exam be comparable to the previous exams?
Absolutely, they will. That's one of the reasons, actually, for the delay, the significant delay in the second quarter. Scores over time, statistically, are comparable from time to time to time. The score that I got when I took the exam a long time ago is comparable to that same score today. And that's done through a very complex process, the foundation of which is psychometrics, which is basically statistics on steroids, that makes sure that there is comparability. So if someone got a 78 today is the same thing as a 78 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And so one of the reasons they're holding the questions is to make sure that's true. One of the reasons they're holding the score reporting in the first window and the second and the third is to make sure that that's correct, that there is comparability. And the only way they can do that is collect enough results to do the statistical analysis that's necessary to be able to answer that question.
Will any new information be provided on the score report?
At this point, there will be no new information provided on the score report. The challenge with the next version of the exam is that there's a lot more information that's provided to candidates about what might be tested that comes through the blueprints. But that also means that if you're going to provide a score report that provides much more detail on how you did on those pieces, the information that's provided to an individual candidate becomes less and less reliable. So they're trying to figure out a way that they can give a score report that gives more information that's meaningful to the candidate. And that's still work in process.
An exam review website states that there are a couple of changes still under consideration. Where do you stand regarding allowing candidates to resit for a failed exam within the same testing window, as well as increasing the overall time frame to pass all sections of the exam?
Let me take those two in order. The first one having to do with resitting for a failed exam during a window. I don't think that's a good idea, and here's why. Because of the high level of statistical precision of the exam, the score that you get is very representative of what your real score is at the time you take it. In statistics, you undoubtedly have learned about standard deviation and standard error. There's a standard error that is very narrow for your score. So let's say that somebody gets a 57. The range of the scores that are probable for that individual is very close to 57. It might be 56 or 55 or 58, but it's not 23 and it's not 79. So when you take that exam today and get a 57, if you take it next week, you're going to get about a 57. And the only way you're going to change that is by additional study and understanding of the exam. So if you have an opportunity to take the exam multiple times in a window, that means that the first time you're taking the exam is at the beginning of a 3-month window, so that you'll get the scores maybe at the end of that month or at the first part of next month. And if you didn't pass, then you have to scramble to get another time, which means you'll take it towards the end of the second month. The problem is, from a study perspective, you haven't studied during the time you waited for the score. You haven't studied because you didn't know if you passed. And so now the amount of time you have to study for the second time in that quarter is 2 weeks. You're not going to affect your score much at all. Might go up a couple points. So if you're right at 74, maybe. But maybe not, because that 74 might be at the high end of your range, which means that the probability of getting a higher score is very low. and the probability is you're going to get a lower one. Really, the way you have an opportunity to change your score is to understand the material better. And that happens through study, and that happens through time. So the ability to take it again in a quarter is frankly a waste of money. The second question about looking at the 18-month window, I think we should look at the 18-month window. And state boards of accountancy are. AICPA is encouraging the state boards of accountancy and NASBA to take a look at that and determine whether the 18-month window should expand to 24 months or some other time. I think there's good arguments for that. The challenge so often when it comes to accounting rules is that they are done state by state, and some rules are embedded in a law, which requires the legislature to pass. Some rules are embedded in a regulation, which is easier to take care of. So the whole process of changing something such as that is a long, involved process. But there's a lot of discussion on that right now, and I think there is interest in expanding the window, and we'll just have to see how it goes.
You mentioned that the next version of the exam having blueprints. Can you tell us a little bit more about those?
I think there's really two really big things that the next version of the exam does. One is to test higher order skills, and the other is the creation of these things called blueprints. And the blueprints are a very detailed roadmap of what you need to know. If you took a look at the information that was provided for the previous exam about the kinds of things you wanted to know, you were told that you needed to know information in this block. A lot of stuff in one category, and there's many, many, many things in there. But you don't really get any detail about what those things are. The blueprint provides that detail. The blueprint says, here's the kinds of questions you may be asked, the types of questions, the areas of questions, in some level of detail. It's over 100 pages long. And it tells you for that item, whether it's remember and understanding, or application, or analysis, or evaluation. Tremendously great addition to the information that you need to understand. It helps the candidate, it helps universities, because now it becomes much more clear the kinds of things that are going to be asked. And I think that's one of the biggest changes that's going to provide all sorts of benefits to candidates and universities and the profession in the future. It's a great roadmap to tell you where you need to go.
With the next version of the exam, is there a recommended sequence in order to take the sections?
Depends on the individual.
Okay.
There is no recommended sequence. Some suggest that you should take BEC first. I don't know. It really depends on the individual. In my view, if you feel strong in a certain area, if you feel strong in auditing or you feel strong in reg, you should take that first. Because part of passing the exam is knowing the stuff, and part of it is what's between your ears on the psychological side. If you think you can, and if you think you can't, you're right. So start off on the right foot. Take a section that you're pretty confident of, and then work towards other sections. So it really depends on the individual, in my view.
I've read that the 2017 version of the exam is going to have increased content integration. Can you elaborate on how much overlap we can expect between the different 4 sections of the exam, as well as how our study habits should change to accommodate for that overlap?
That's one of the things that has been mentioned that people are a little concerned about. But I would suggest that it's no different than how accounting is right now. You can't audit inventory if you don't understand how inventory is accounted for. Great example. You can't audit the lease if you don't understand how the lease is accounted for. So already there is integration in what you study and in what the exam tests. It assumes that you have some basic understanding of the accounting rules, financial accounting rules in particular, in order to be able to answer questions in the FAR section and in the other sections. So in the past, questions have been created that tried to make a very strict line so that lack of knowledge on some topic didn't hurt you on answering the question that was trying to be asked. But as we've studied it more over time, we've determined that there already is integration. And although we don't want to, on the auditing exam, ask a question that's really a financial question in disguise, we don't also want to ignore the fact that people should understand the accounting rules in order to answer that auditing question. So it's not so much of a change, it's just a realization that we already are integrated. We do need to make sure that the question on a certain section really pertains to that section, but we can't ignore the fact that you have to know other things in order to answer that question, just as part of knowing accounting in general. I'd like to thank you all for being here. This has been very enjoyable for me. It's got me to think again about the kinds of things that we thought about when I was chair of the Board of Examiners, many of the same kind of questions that you've asked. And I always find it helpful to be able to answer questions of people that are about ready to be part of the greatest profession in the world. This is not an easy exam. We want to make sure you understand the material, and that's what we want to test. But we want you to be as prepared and as confident when you walk in the door as you can. And understanding more about the exam and getting your questions answered about what the exam is doing and not doing are very important. So I appreciate the time you've taken today.
To echo what Rick just said, thank you. It's a rainy early morning, and we all know how busy you are, but I cannot tell you how much I have learned from sitting here. Your questions were outstanding. I could also see, he doesn't know this about my ability where he is concerned, but I could see your wheels turning. There's no question about it. So thank you very, very much. It's been such an honor to have such a wonderful array of our colleges and universities throughout North Carolina represented here today. And I have no doubt that the audience for this program is going to benefit significantly. And again, fine sir, thank you for all you've done to create the next version of the exam. And we appreciate your time and your vast knowledge on the subject.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.